Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give everybody a second to get settled, and then we're going to get started. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jaclyn Siano. I'm one of the client directors here at Inspired Instruction, and thank you so much for coming to this month's webinar, which is on preparing students for high-stakes ELA assessments. All right, so just so you guys know, at the conclusion of this webinar, sometime in the next 24 hours, you will receive an email with a link to the recording so you can watch it again or rewatch parts that you liked and that you want to take away. And you'll also get a document with all the resources that I'm going to highlight today. So our agenda for this webinar is we are going to be talking about evidence-based test taking strategies and instructional best practices for overall test taking for ELA high-stakes assessments. Then we're going to dive a little bit into techniques for multiple choice questions. And then we're going to talk about the 6-step process for writing. So if you're a teacher, I'm hoping these are strategies that you can take away and implement in your classes. If you're an administrator or a coach, I'm hoping these are helpful strategies that you can turnkey to your own staff. So let's get started. We're going to start with evidence-based test taking strategies. So when we're talking about high stakes assessments, one of the biggest things is to know the tools that the students are going to be working with on the actual test. And what I mean by this is making sure that the students have familiarity with what they're going to be using and what they're going to be doing. So keeping in mind that during the actual assessments, test administrators are not allowed to help kids. So if they don't understand how to, click an answer or where to put the essay or things like that, you can't help them during testing. So it is really important that they know what they're doing and how to do it way ahead of the test. So we want to make sure that we are providing students opportunities to become familiar with the actual program, whatever it happens to be, Pearson or whatnot. So I know that Pearson for New Jersey, they have tutorials, and the tutorials are super helpful for both teachers and for students. So what I have up on the screen is a sample of the Pearson tutorial for NJSLA. So on this website, and it's mypearsonsupport.com practice tests. So even before we get into the practice testing piece, we want to make sure that the kids know how to use the actual program itself and the different tools available. So if you go to any of the tests, in this case, we're going to go to English Language Arts. On the side, it says tutorials. There's an overall tutorial about how to use TestNav as an assessment tool. And then there's one specifically for grade levels. There's also ones for text-to-speech, ASL, closed captioning. It is really helpful regardless of what grade level your kids are in, even if they've taken the NJSLA before or your state's high stakes assessment in the past, to let them practice with the actual tools of the test. And I do love how this tutorial actually sets it up as an actual test. So they're looking at what they will be looking at on test day. So again, tutorial shows you, this is what you do with part A and part B. This is how you use the arrows. It shows you all the different choices up here for different things, how to bookmark, and it really walks you through all the different aspects. So that's best practice number one, is making sure that you are making sure that the students are familiar with the actual module and the program that they're going to be using. Because even if they can read and they can write and they can do all these different things, if they don't know how to use the process on the actual testing program, it's all for naught. All right, next best practice, exposure is crucial. So once we've done the tutorial and the kids are familiar with what the testing program does and how to use the different tools in the testing program, we want to make sure that we're utilizing sample questions and tests. And you can do that in a variety of different ways. We know that there are actual practice tests that you can use as on-demand practice to do like here's a full RST, a full LAT. But you also can use them as models. You can use them as gallery walks. You can use them as centers. The goal is just to get these kids exposed to what the test looks like, and what the expectations are. So in New Jersey, we have 3 different places that we can go to for sample tests and sample questions. You have the digital item library. And with the digital item library, you have by standard different questions. It tells you whether it's an EBSR or a TECR or an LAT or, you know, any of those things. So this is by standard. So that is super helpful. You also have the New Meridian resources, which has actual released tests, also shows some student answers, shows rubrics, shows a variety of different things that you can use. The sample student responses are really great for centers. And then you have the page I was on before that has the tutorials. They also have full-on practice tests that you can use all or some of. So making sure that our kids are exposed to not only the program, but also test questions, really, really important, because again, we want them to feel like they're walking into something comfortable, not something that they've never seen before. And I wasn't a very good test taker when I was in school. I had really bad anxiety with tests. We know that student anxiety has risen, you know, post-COVID. So one of the other things that I highly recommend is teaching kids just how to work through testing roadblocks. So this document is actually going to be shared in those resources that I mentioned. You'll get a copy of via email after the webinar. But, you know, having them think about, okay, what are the possible things that could go wrong during the test? And not to scare them, not to make them nervous, but to help them think of solutions, right? So for example, you read a question, it's worded in a way that you find confusing, you don't understand what the question is asking you. What are some potential solutions? And this is definitely something that you could edit and you could make your own based on things that you know make your own students anxious. But I envision using this in a couple of different ways. Yes, it could be an independent activity where you ask kids to come up with solutions to these problems. I see it as a really great collaborative activity where students could be in groups, or you could do it as a gallery walk and post different roadblocks around different parts of the room and have kids come up with different solutions. But we definitely want to make sure that kids know that there are strategies, because people do get nervous when they get to tests. And what do you do if something does not go perfectly? We don't, you know, put our head down and give up. What are, you know, ways we can get through some of these testing roadblocks? So doing solutions to potential problems is definitely a fun activity for kids, but it also helps them realize that, listen, you know, tests are stressful, but we can overcome this, and there are ways to do that. All right, moving on. I think this fact is really, really important. Research shows that students' understanding of 55 critical words contributes to 85% of success on standardized assessments. If our kids don't know the language that's going to be used on the test, how do we expect them to succeed? So one of my other general best practices for preparing kids for high stakes assessment is to pre-teach and integrate testing vocabulary. So as like I said, if they don't understand the language, how are they going to understand what's being asked from them? So I recommend explicitly teaching common testing vocabulary. You can do that as a word wall. You can do this as, you know, vocabulary activities that you do with any other kind of vocabulary. Model and encourage students to use testing vocabulary. And this comes from a list, and you guys, again, will get a copy of this list in the handout that you receive after the webinar. But it's 55 words. It's based on grade level and what words are most likely to be used in each grade level on the test. So you will get a copy of that as well. But words like describe, infer, cite, things that they're going to be asked to do. So we want to make sure that if a student is asked to infer something, that they know what infer means versus, you know, to cite something or to paraphrase something. So just familiarizing kids with that testing vocabulary through a word wall, through vocabulary activities, through collaborative discussion, maybe giving them extra credit for using those words in sentences on other assessments, however you want to do it, but making sure the kids understand these words. And a lot of these words directly connect to the standards anyway, and what they're being expected to do in the ELA standards, being able to cite and trace arguments and paraphrase and analyze. So just making sure they have a really clear understanding of what those things are and what they mean. Aligning your own assessments in your classroom is also a really great strategy for helping kids do better on the high stakes assessments. Again, we want them walking into test day not being, oh my gosh, I've never seen this before. What is this? We want that level of familiarity. So aligning your own assessments to the standardized tests can be really helpful for kids. And one of the things you can do that is a really easy lift is to use text-dependent questions in all of your assessments, formative, summative, alternative, making sure that those text-dependent questions are focused on specific phrases and sentences in whatever you have read, because we want to ensure that the kids are comprehending what they're reading. Because a very large chunk of high stakes ELA assessments is about comprehension. If the kids don't understand what they're reading, they can't answer the questions and they can't respond in essay form. So we want to make sure that we are getting them used to using text-dependent questions and answering those questions. Making sure that we're guiding students and how do we determine what is the key meaning or the key idea of what I just read. Exploring specific words and details and arguments, making sure that we can discuss as a class and individually, how does that one section of the text or that one word or that one argument contribute to the impact as a whole. So, trying to figure out author's meaning or purpose, that kind of stuff. And then we also want to make sure we're targeting academic vocabulary and specific sentence structure. And again, these are all things that you are probably already doing because you're addressing them in the standards. We want to make sure that every assessment that we're giving, whether it's formative or summative, even if it doesn't look like your high stakes assessment for your state, we want to make sure at minimum those questions are text dependent, because that's what they're going to be asked on the test. And we want to make sure that students are able to not only choose the right answer, but that they're able to defend those answers. So another resource that's going to be shared after the webinar is some text-dependent question starters. So things like, the author provides a list of blank. What do these things have in common? How do we, use evidence from the text to determine why the author gave the article this title? So again, these are things that you could even use in discussion. You can have students create their own text-dependent questions. That's something that I did often when I was teaching, is when we were preparing for an assessment, they would come up with their own quiz questions, but they had to be text-dependent. So you absolutely can give them these types of question starters to help as a model. All right, moving on to multiple choice questions. So anything that requires multiple choice response, whether that be a technology constructed response where we have to pick multiple things, or it's 4 answers and we have to pick one, or it's 6 answers and we have to pick 2, whatever it happens to be, that's what we're going to focus on next. So I think explicitly teaching strategies for test taking is really important. And I know as a teacher, you always want to say, I don't want to teach to the test. So we're not teaching to the test, we're teaching them strategies to support them with any test that they take going forward in their life. And we know that they're going to be taking a lot of tests going forward. So whether it be the NJSLA, the PARC, their driving test, whatever it happens to be, we want to explicitly teach them strategies for test taking. So one of those strategies is to teach them to always read the questions first. So that means before you read any of the texts on your high stakes assessment, tell students that they should be looking at the questions briefly, because they want to know what is their focus area going to be while reading. So if they're actually doing practice in class, it might be on paper. So maybe it's highlighting or annotating what the questions are asking me. If they're actually on the test, it's using the highlighter tool or using the note-taking tool. What do I need to make sure I am looking for as I am reading these texts on the test? And the only way to know that is to read the questions first. We want to make sure we're teaching them to highlight important information, because as we know, there are highlighter tools on the actual test platform, and we can give them physical highlighters to use in class. I know kids struggle with, well, what do I highlight? And sometimes they just highlight everything. So teaching them how to highlight is a really important strategy. And one of the easy ways that I found to do this is asking them a specific text-dependent question and then telling them to highlight only the answer. And that just gets them used to, we don't highlight everything. We're looking for specific things. We only highlight the most important information. Teaching them to skip and come back. A lot of times kids get hung up on that one question and they're struggling with it, they don't understand it, and they wind up spending all their time on that and then wind up not finishing the test. So we want to make sure that, they know we don't want them to skip every question, but we want them to know that if you're really struggling on one question, you can skip it and go back to it. That is totally okay. And if you miss one question, it's much better than missing half the test because you were so focused on that one question. In terms of aligning your own assessments, if you are doing any kind of multiple choice assessment in your class, we want to really focus on how do we make our own assessments similar or mirrored to our high stakes assessments. And one thing you can do is create your own distractors in your assessments that model what is going to be expected of them on the state test or on your high stakes assessment. So the primary purpose of a distractor is you basically have the one or two answers that are not right, but the only way the student's going to know that it's not right is if they truly comprehended what was expected of them. So the purpose of a distractor is to provide evidence to you as an educator that the students fully comprehend the standard that they are being tested on. So I always used to describe it to my kids that you have 4 answer choices. One is your right answer. Usually you have one that is an obvious wrong answer. And then you have 2 that you have to kind of figure out which one, why and how they don't apply. And those 2 are what we call distractors. And they usually are aligned with common student misconceptions. So distractors have to be plausible. So I have this example up here. One of the things that to me is always an easy giveaway is if they're not parallel in sentence structure. So if you have all your sentences, all your answer choices kind of look the same way, there's less chance that kids are going to be able to pick out the obvious wrong answer. So we want to make sure that they're plausible in responses and they're plausible in regards to how they are laid out in terms of structure. We don't want to use negative distractors. So if 3 of the answers are positive in wording and 1 is negative, usually that's an easy tip-off of which one is not correct. Again, all similar in how they are worded, and they're not ordered alphabetically. And it seems like silly things, but we know kids are smart. Like they can pick up like, oh, well, I see everything here is C. So I'm just going to keep picking C going forward because everything is in alphabetical order, or that's just how my teacher set it up. So we want to really make them think. We don't want them to have our assessments be so much easier than the rigor that's expected of them on the state test. So when you're creating your own distractors, just think about, okay, I have my right answer, I have my wrong answer, and then what are 2 other answers that I could create that a student who didn't quite understand what was being asked of them or didn't fully comprehend the text, they might think is right. Those are your distractors. And again, that just really aligns your own assessments with the rigor of the high stakes assessments. Now, as you're doing this, I always tell my kids, like, we're not out to trick you, right? No one's out to get you, but we want to make sure that you fully understand what you're supposed to understand, because that's what the test is assessing, is do you comprehend the standards? Do you comprehend the skills? So we do want to teach kids the process of identifying distractors, because again, that is a test-taking skill. So once they're comfortable with identifying distractors, then they can move on to process of elimination on the actual test because they'll know what to look for. So you absolutely can teach them that whole, listen, if there's 4 choices, you have a right, a wrong, and 2 possibles. Those 2 possible ones are the ones that you want to try to eliminate, because then it's going to just make your life easier because you're really, lowering the number of choices that you have to choose from. One of the things I think is really helpful is we always jump to ask the kids, what's the right answer? Every once in a while, ask the kids, what's the wrong answer and why, before you reveal that correct answer. It really forces them to think it through. It engages them in metacognition. It engages them in that qualitative, quantitative thinking, and making them, force themselves to, okay, this one's wrong because. And forcing them to do that shows deductive reasoning, and that's a huge life skill in addition to a skill they need to use on the assessment. So another resource that you're going to be getting after the webinar is what we call our distractor sheet. And it really is, you can pick any question. It could be a question from a practice test, it could be a question from one of your assessments. You ask the kids to write out the question and write out the answer choices, and you could even do that for them. And then they are basically explaining why each answer is correct or incorrect and why. And this is something that I've seen when I've gone into classrooms. Teachers often do as a gallery walk, and I love it. So they would put up A, B, C, D on different corners of the room, and kids would go over with Post-it notes and put correct or incorrect and why, and then let everybody walk around and see how everybody, voted, and then turn it into a group discussion. So again, we're forcing kids to use some deductive reasoning to engage in metacognition, not just picking an answer because they have to pick an answer, but pick it because it's showing their demonstration, their comprehension of the standards. All right, let us take a dive into writing. And we do have a question and answer forum. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put that in the Q&A forum. I do have someone who asked, will we get a copy of the slides? We will not be getting a copy of the slides, but what you will be getting is the resource sheet. And then you will also have access to the recording on the website, both of which will be delivered to you via email after this. So if anybody has any questions, absolutely, please feel free to put that in the Q&A section. All right, the 6-step process for writing. So for high stakes assessments, we know that there is a reading and multiple choice question part, and then there's the writing part. I think writing for a lot of kids, and I was an English teacher for a very long time in tested grade level, writing is scary for kids. Just overall, writing is scary. So at Inspired Instruction, we came up with this 6-step process that we go through anytime that we do PD and training on state tests, and how to kind of alleviate that anxiety of writing for students that is scary on a daily basis if you have to write just an essay for class, and then it usually is magnified when we get onto a high stakes assessment. So a lot of times kids will get on that high stakes assessment and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to start. I don't have enough time to do this. This is too hard for me. And they shut down and they don't write anything. When we go and review, after the fact, what kids wrote on these assessments, a lot of times they leave it blank, and it's just, they either don't know how to do it or they're too freaked out to do it. They're afraid of failure, whatever it happens to be. So we found that this 6-step process gives kids the formula to follow. So my suggestion is to teach the steps in isolation, one step at a time. And it might be over a series of weeks, over a series of months. I know we're getting close to test taking time now, but thinking going forward, this is something I started with my kids in September. And we would start from the very beginning and just work our way through. And then if you go through all the 6 steps and teach them, all these different strategies for how to respond to any writing prompt, not just the ones on high stakes assessments, but if they're writing college essays or just essays for their social studies class, they were going to have this huge repertoire of strategies from which to choose when they get on the state test and when they have to write any writing prompt for any course or anything in their future. And that's really what we want. We want to teach them all the possible strategies, and then they can determine which ones they actually need as scaffolds for themselves. So the 6-step process we use, the first one is identifying the requirements. Next is writing the thesis statement. Third is gathering evidence, then organizing the evidence and constructing an outline, writing the essay, and revising and editing. So like I said, my suggestion is to teach these in isolation. And that means not saying at some point you're not going to go through the entire thing for one writing prompt, but starting out slow. Because I've noticed that with my students, I taught high school, testing subject, testing grade. If you throw too much at them, they shut down even more. And the goal of this is to teach them a process that they can pick and choose what strategies work best for them. So I'm going to explain it in isolation and different ways that you can do each thing and teach each step of the process. And then eventually the goal is to get to the whole process, and that anytime the kids get any writing prompt, they can go through the process as fast or as slow as they individually need to, knowing all these different strategies. So step 1 is to identify the requirements. So when a student gets an essay topic, if we're on the state test, the prose-constructed response, we want students to be able to identify, what does the prompt tell us? what am I required to do, including what genre am I supposed to be writing, and which text or texts must be used. So a lot of times my students used to complain, I don't know what they're asking me to do. And then they would just shut down and not do it. So before they even get to the writing, teaching them, okay, let's just figure out what the prompt is asking us to do. One way that I like to do that is using highlighters. Yellow, what is the prompt assert? So that means, what is it telling us already? What information is it giving us that I can use in my essay? Blue, what sorry, what do you have to do? Write an essay, write a biography, write a newspaper article. Whatever you have to physically do, that's what you're going to highlight in blue. In green, does it tell you what text or text must be used? 99% of the time on a state test, it tells you have to include evidence from all the text that you just read, but it's a good habit to get kids involved in, because again, we're not just teaching test taking skills for that state test, we're teaching life skills for writing. So sometimes it will say use 2 pieces of evidence. Sometimes it will say use any 2 sources. We want them just to get in the habit of being able to determine what is a prompt asking me to do. So once the students are able to identify the prompt, and that's something you can do as a whole class, it's something you can do as a graphic organizer, you can do it on chart paper, however you want to teach them to do that. The next step is to write the thesis statement. So I always tell them, you always go back to the previous step. So step 1, we asked you to identify what the prompt is asking. We want to use that to write our thesis statement. And then we need to scaffold for our kids as needed. So obviously, if we're starting this in September, we're going to start slow, more scaffolds, and then hopefully by test taking time, the kids are able to write a thesis without too much support. If we're starting now, you absolutely still can scaffold, just keeping in mind that we might have to move through the scaffolds a little faster because we're getting closer to test taking time. So some of my favorite scaffolds for teaching kids how to write thesis statements: you could provide students with a mostly complete thesis and have them finish it. I used to do a lot of fill in the blank, and just as practice, like, hey, we just read this text. Let's pretend that we're going to write an essay on this. And you might not even write the essay on it. And that's what I'm talking about when I say teaching these steps in isolation. But we're just going to practice writing a thesis statement. Here's a fill in the blank. What would you put here? You can provide students with several thesis statements and ask them to select which would be the best one if this was my essay topic and I was asking you to write an essay on this. Which thesis would you choose? And again, you could use something like the distractor sheet, where they have to explain why they would choose this thesis and how it supports what's being asked of them in the prompt. You could provide students with a thesis and ask them to write an alternative one. I used to have my kids swap. They would write one and then they'd swap it with somebody else, and the other person would edit it and then they'd swap it. And eventually we'd try to get to one cohesive, conclusive one of this is the perfect thesis that we would use if this was our essay topic. And then I always like to give my kids checklists for everything, because I do think it's helpful for my visual kids, especially. Okay, did my thesis do all of these things? And that's how I know that, it's appropriate. And again, this is something that I always modeled as a whole class for the first couple of months of school before I let them go off on their own. And the checklist was definitely an anchor chart that I had up on my wall at all times. Step 3 is gathering evidence. And I mentioned before, sometimes kids just highlight everything. And sometimes this is a really hard step for them, is to figure out, okay, I determined what the prompt is asking me. I wrote my thesis statement. Now I got to find support. How do I do that? So again, we always go back to the previous step. We tell students, okay, remember what your thesis statement says. I would always have them reread the passages, however many there are, 2 or 3, keeping your thesis in mind, highlighting 2 to 3 pieces of evidence in each text that supports your thesis statement. And then I'm a huge fan of graphic organizers. And this is another resource that you'll get after the webinar. So this is like the ultimate essay writing with textual evidence graphic organizer. Thesis statement goes on top. Their reason, their evidence from the text, explain it. How does it support my thesis? So in addition to having them highlight any potential textual evidence that could support their thesis, I think having them use a graphic organizer, I think having them work with a partner, those are all really helpful scaffolds for when you're first teaching them, how do I pick evidence that supports my thesis? We used to do a lot of group essays in my classes where we would pick the evidence together on the whiteboard, and then we would plug it into the outline together. And then they would have that model in their notebook for when it was time to gradual release and let them go do their own thing. All right, step 4 is to organize that evidence and construct an outline. So we use the previous 3 steps to create our outline. We scaffold as needed, and that might be providing a pre-constructed outline and asking students to complete some of it. So again, fill in the blank. I was a big fan of fill in the blank and doing it together on the smartboard. You could have them practice by just outlining one paragraph. You could ask students just to identify the topic sentences. Or I used to also make like these crazy outlines that looked like a 7-year-old did them and make them revise it. How would you make this appropriate for the prompt that you have in front of you? This was another anchor chart that I had in my classroom that just basically showed a general outline for these are the different things that should be in an introduction, a body paragraph, a conclusion, and that was always up on my wall. And this way, because my students wrote a lot. So anytime they had to write an essay, they knew this is exactly what I need to make sure is in there. And it's just, again, helpful level of support, layer of support for my visual students in addition to me explaining it. And then finally, they'll write the essay. The biggest piece of advice I can give is to make sure you give your students some kind of process, formula, something on what a body paragraph should look like. Because a lot of times they just don't know what should be in there. And I find especially that when they're required to include citations or they're required to provide textual evidence, which we know they are on any high stakes assessment, they kind of just throw a quote in there and walk away. And I call that a drowning quote. I always tell them you have to put stuff around that quote or it's gonna drown. You have to make sure that you preface it and that you also explain it. So giving the kids some kind of process, some kind of formula, some kind of outline of what a body paragraph should include. So definitely a topic sentence, textual support, explanation of that text support, and the so what, right? Why am I even explaining this? Because you really want to make sure it ties back into their thesis. And then transitions. Teaching my kids transitions, that was another anchor chart that I had on my wall. Transition words, especially for my multilingual learners, that was a tough one. They didn't quite understand the purpose of transition sentences or transition words. So that was something that I explicitly taught lessons about and always had an anchor chart up in my classroom on it. And this is just a helpful visual, something, again, anchor chart, something they keep in their notebook, etc., of what a body paragraph should look like. It's called the quote sandwich in the middle. And that's why I always tell them no drowning quotes. You need to make sure that you have stuff to surround that quote that has information before it and then the so what afterwards. And then lastly, revising and editing. My students hated revising and editing, and I forced them to do it because it is a really important skill. My students were very big on, well, I'm done, so I'm done. Here it is. I'm clicking, turn it in. I don't want to look at it again. And I think teaching them how to revise and edit is really important because going forward, we know as adults, one draft is never sufficient. Okay, even before I send an email, I look it over 6 times. So we want to make sure that we're teaching these kids these really important skills, not just for test taking, but for life. So again, checklist, another anchor chart, something they keep in their notebook. For essays, it's did you respond to all parts of the prompt? So that's going back to, you told me in step 1 that this prompt requires you to ABC. Did you do all of that in your essay? Did you develop a claim that addresses the prompt? That was step 2, your thesis statement. Did you provide text support for every claim and reason? That was steps 3 and 4. Does the essay incorporate the elements of the genre? So that is, if it asked you to write a newspaper article, does it look like a newspaper article? Did it ask you to write a letter? Does it look like a letter? So just really quick checklist. Did you do all of these things? And then my other best practice is I always used the NJSLA rubric with my kids. Like they knew it from the beginning of the school year. And they would use that rubric to self-assess their writing and then also to peer assess their writing. And I think the rubric for any state test, sometimes it's not really worded in student-friendly language. So one of my favorite activities at the beginning of the year was we made our own version of the rubric in student-friendly language and posted it up in the classroom. So it was shorter sentences, easier words that just said, to get a 4, I have to do this, this, and this. To get a 3, I have to do this, this, and this. And then we use that all year long to self and peer assess every piece of writing that they did. So they were very familiar come test time as to what the expectations were for writing. And that I held them to the same rigor and the same standards and the same expectations on everything they wrote throughout the entire year. I hope that was helpful. I know I threw a lot of information at you. I wanted to let you know that on our website, we have tons of free lesson plans and activities specifically for high stakes assessments for both ELA and math. And they're free. You can download them. They're lesson plans, soup to nuts, everything included in there, reproducibles, all that good stuff. So I know that preparing kids for high stakes assessment can sometimes be challenging and overwhelming. It's a lot of steps, and it's anxiety inducing for the teachers just as much as it is for the students. So we do want to make your lives easier. So we do have tons of free lesson plans and activities to help prepare your kids for the assessment. On our website, inspiredinstruction.com, is under the resources section. And on the left-hand side, you can filter by Park NJSLA and what you're looking for. You can also search by keywords. So if you're looking for, grade 5, or you're looking for LATs, whatever it happens to be, you can use that as well. And then we also do have tons of PD support. Right now, we are doing a lot of stuff on high stakes assessments with schools, in person, virtual, asynchronously. If you've run out of PD time, but you still want to do PD for your teachers, we do offer asynchronous courses on all high stakes assessments topics, because we want to make sure that our teachers have everything they need to be successful so that our students can be successful. So I do hope this was helpful. I hope you got some new strategies. As I mentioned, you will be getting a copy of the handout that has all the resources, and you will be getting a link to the recording so that if you want to watch anything again, if you want to share it with colleagues, so that they can pull some strategies. And I just put in the chat a survey. And I'm hoping that if you guys could take a few minutes and fill out, because we do always like to know if what we are doing is helpful to educators. My email address is on there as well if you do have any follow-up questions, or if you want to work to book some support for your school, please do not hesitate to reach out. And our website as well is there, and I will put all of those in the chat as well. So again, I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can also put in the Q&A section if you have questions as well. So thank you so much for your time. I know it's a busy time of year, so I appreciate you joining me.